They watched her step through the checkpoint like a storm walking on legs. Lieutenant Ava Richter, her file still warm from a transfer that no one had requested, crossed the concrete courtyard of Camp Ravenfield with the precision of someone who didn't waste motion. Her boots hit the ground in measured rhythm, neither hurried nor hesitant. Everything about her seemed quiet until you realized it wasn't silence at all. It was control. The kind that makes people lower their voices without knowing why. The base quartermaster was the first to notice something off. New arrivals always followed the same script: collect gear, sign the standard requisition, move on. But Ava didn't read from that playbook. She stood before the counter, sliding a form across with a single line written in black ink: request for modified M8 configuration, cross sling, side optic, short rail, under barrel harness. The sergeant behind the desk frowned. That setup's not regulation, he said, waiting for her to flinch, to explain, to apologize. She didn't. It works, she replied simply, tone flat, eyes steady. He tried to laugh it off. This isn't some off-grid militia. You'll take what's issued, Lieutenant. She said nothing, only adjusted the strap of her duffel, the faintest smirk twitching at the corner of her mouth. Then issue what works, she said. The room went still long enough for the sergeant to forget his next breath. Within an hour, the story spread. Did you hear about the new lieutenant? Wants to redesign her rifle like she's in a video game, probably one of those private contract types who think tactics come from documentaries. The barracks fed on rumor the way wolves feed on blood. By midday, everyone knew her name. They didn't know her history, only that she walked like she'd already seen the ending. Evening drills brought the gossip into daylight. Rows of recruits in regulation formation lined the field, rifles gleaming identically beneath the sun. Ava stood apart, her issued weapon still in its case. The senior instructor, a broad-shouldered captain named Wilkes, caught sight of her and barked, "Lieutenant, you planning to sight in that thing or just admire the packaging?" She stepped forward, eyes narrowing against the glare. Not until I can sight it the right way. The laughter rolled across the field like thunder, the harmless cruelty of soldiers who hadn't yet learned what danger looked like. Wilkes shook his head. You think you know better than the manual? Ava answered without looking up. The manual's never been shot at. That silenced the first few snickers, but only for a heartbeat. Someone muttered, "Guess she learned tactics from YouTube." Another chimed in, "Maybe she's allergic to standard issue." The jokes bounced between them, brittle and nervous. She ignored everyone. Later, alone in the armory, she laid the rifle on the workbench. Her movements were surgical, stock adjusted, sling reversed, scope mounted at an angle no instructor would approve. The hum of the overhead lights filled the silence as she locked the bolt forward and checked alignment. Her fingers paused once, hovering over the trigger housing, as if remembering a sound or a face. Then she continued, deliberate, precise, mechanical. Outside, two privates passed by the open doorway, whispering, "She's insane. No one fights like that." The second one frowned. No one used to. When she finally slung the rifle across her shoulder, the crossbody mount sat flush, balanced, almost elegant, a configuration meant not for display, but survival. She stood before the mirror bolted to the far wall, adjusting the strap until it felt right. In the reflection, the dim light caught a faint line of scar tissue running beneath the collar of her uniform, half hidden, half deliberate. It wasn't vanity that drove her request. It was memory, discipline, the weight of something once earned and long denied. Outside, the bugle called lights out. Ava rested the rifle against the wall and sat on the edge of her bunk, eyes fixed on nothing. The room smelled of oil and metal, the scent of every place she'd ever tried to forget. Somewhere in the base's data logs, a flag tripped, non-standard equipment request, pending approval, level 4 clearance required. At 2,300 hours, the alert reached the command tower. General Marcus Heller scrolled through the requisition, expression darkening as his eyes caught the configuration code. The setup wasn't just non-standard. It was extinct, last authorized for use under Operation Tharsis Ridge, a black file buried so deep most of the living pretended it never happened. He leaned back in his chair, whispering to no one in particular, who the hell taught her that. Down in the barracks, Ava lay awake, one hand on the strap of the rifle beside her bed. The laughter from earlier echoed faintly through the halls, already fading. She didn't need to defend the request. The rifle would speak soon enough. The sun came up over Camp Ravenfield like a furnace, heat radiating off the gravel until the air shimmered. Sweat darkened the backs of uniforms before the first whistle blew. Rows of recruits stood rigid, rifles shouldered, waiting for the command to begin live-fire drills. Ava stood at the far end of the line, her stance effortless, weight distributed, breath measured, eyes locked downrange. The others had stopped mocking her openly, but their glances lingered like mosquitoes. A few still whispered behind her, voices sharp and brittle with the kind of fear they didn't yet recognize as respect. By mid-morning, the heat grew unbearable. Sweat trickled down her neck, pooling at the edge of her collar. Without a word, she shrugged off her field jacket, rolling her shoulders to free the tension. The motion was unremarkable until the light hit her skin. Ink, faded and deliberate, curved along her upper arm and shoulder. At first it seemed like another tattoo, a symbol of defiance, maybe something reckless and young. But then the pattern took shape, the angular jaw of a wolf's head, teeth bared, 7 hash marks like scars slashed across the back. The black lines caught in the sunlight, and for a moment it looked almost alive. Someone near the back laughed, the nervous kind that fills silence before it turns heavy. "Nice art, Lieutenant," a voice called. "Trying to look tough?" Another snickered. The instructor, Sergeant Wilkes, shot them a glare but didn't intervene. He was watching her too. Everyone was. Across the range, General Marcus Heller had been inspecting the drills, walking the perimeter with his usual precision. He was the kind of man who noticed everything: trigger discipline, eye movement, the rhythm of breath before a shot. But when he turned toward Ava's lane, something in his expression fractured. His stride slowed, one step faltering like a man suddenly remembering a nightmare. He didn't hear the laughter. Didn't hear the rifles clattering back onto the racks. All he saw was the ink, that impossible mark on her shoulder, the wolf's head framed by 7 lines. He knew it by heart, though he hadn't seen it in years. Wolfpack Alpha. The unofficial insignia of a reconnaissance unit so classified that its name had been erased from every record after Tharsis Ridge. Officially, they had never existed. Unofficially, they were the reason a dozen nations still slept without fear. Heller stopped in front of her. The recruits fell silent instantly, sensing the shift in air pressure, the weight of something sacred and broken. Ava turned her head slightly, her face impassive. The general's voice was low, barely above a whisper. "Where did you get that tattoo?" The wind caught the edges of the range flag, flapping once before falling still again. No one dared to move. Ava's gaze met his, calm and unflinching. She didn't answer, didn't blink. The silence stretched thin, taut as a wire. Wilkes tried to fill the void. "Sir, the lieutenant." Heller raised a hand, cutting him off without looking. His eyes stayed on Ava. The two of them stood there like statues carved from the same memory. Finally, he spoke again, softer this time, almost to himself. That mark was never meant to be seen again. For the briefest second, something flickered behind Ava's eyes, not surprise, not fear, but recognition. The kind shared by people who had stood on the same ground when the world fell apart. Then it was gone, her face folding back into the calm mask she wore like armor. Around them, recruits shifted uneasily. They didn't understand what they were witnessing, only that the atmosphere had changed, as if the range itself remembered. Heller took a step back, his expression unreadable. "Carry on," he said finally, voice clipped, official, but his tone carried something else, the tremor of unfinished history. He turned and walked toward the command tower, his boots crunching against gravel that suddenly sounded too loud. Ava watched him go, jaw tightening. The whispers started again, cautious, uncertain. What was that about? He looked like he saw a ghost. When the drills resumed, her focus didn't waver. Each shot landed clean, centered, precise. But as the brass casings clinked to the ground, the faint imprint of the wolf glinted once more under the sun, an old ghost stirring awake. Up in the tower, Heller closed the blinds and opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside lay a single file folder, edges frayed, stamped with fading ink, Operation Tharsis Ridge, Wolfpack Alpha. He flipped it open, eyes scanning a page with 8 photographs. 7 faces lined the top row. One was crossed out. The 8th space at the bottom right had no picture, only a name written in hand. Richter, A. Status: deceased ****. Heller stared at it for a long time before whispering to the empty room, "You weren't supposed to come back." Down on the range, Ava Rabutt toned her sleeve, hiding the mark once more, though she knew it was too late. The past had already found her. The command room smelled of dust and cold metal, the kind of air that remembered too much. The overhead lights were dimmed to a dull amber, throwing long shadows across the floor. General Heller stood by the far end of the table, hands braced on the edge, eyes fixed on the stack of folders spread before him. The black stamps across the covers read obsidian clearance, a level reserved for ghosts, for missions that didn't exist, for names no longer spoken aloud. When Ava entered, the door shut behind her with a hydraulic sigh. She stood at attention, her posture calm but coiled, like a blade that hadn't decided if it needed to strike. Heller didn't speak immediately. He simply stared at her, the silence thickening until it felt like another presence in the room. Then he reached down, opened one of the folders, and pulled out a faded photograph. 8 soldiers stood in front of a snow-crusted ridge, their faces half obscured by frost and fatigue. Each wore the same patch on their shoulders, the stylized wolf's head, 7 marks behind it. The image was old, taken in a different world under a sky that had probably forgotten their names. One face was circled in red. Heller slid the photograph across the table. It stopped inches from Ava's hand. "You were supposed to be dead," he said, voice rough from disuse. Ava looked down at the image without touching it. Her expression didn't change. The seconds passed like slow-moving ice. "A lot of things were supposed to happen," she finally said. Heller straightened, his jaw tight. "Tharsis Ridge. We sent Wolfpack Alpha on infiltration, strategic recon, deep terrain. You never came back. The report said the team was lost in an avalanche." "That's what they wrote," Ava replied quietly. Easier than admitting what really happened. He exhaled, long and slow, the sound of memory dragging its claws through him. "Then tell me." Ava's eyes lifted, catching the weak light. "We were sent to extract a diplomat team captured in the upper Andes. The ridge wasn't the problem, command was. Midway through the ascent, communications died. We requested evac 3 times. No response. When the storm hit, we lost 2 in the first hour. Another bled out before sunrise, her voice stayed steady, clinical. By day 3, the extraction was off the books. Someone up top pulled the line. We realized we'd been cut loose." Heller listened without interrupting. The only sound was the faint buzz of the lights and the rustle of paper as he turned the file's pages, after-action reports full of fabricated coordinates, falsified signatures, lies written neatly in military typeface. "You made it down alone," he said. Not alone, she hesitated, just long enough for something to flicker behind her eyes. There were others. They didn't make it far. Supplies froze. Comms fried. I adapted what was left. Heller frowned. The rifle. Ava nodded once. Cross-sling. Offset optics. I built it from 3 broken rifles and a comms harness. When you're crawling through vertical ice, regulation gear gets you killed. I didn't redesign the weapon for vanity, General. I rebuilt it to survive. He rubbed a hand across his mouth, studying her. And when you got out? They told me to sign the death report, she said simply. It was easier that way. No questions. No briefings. Just a promise to forget. For a long while, neither spoke. The photograph lay between them, the wolf insignia glaring up like a wound that hadn't healed. Heller finally moved, walking toward the narrow window that overlooked the training field below. "Do you know what Tharsis Ridge cost?" he asked. 6 nations pulled their envoys. 3 governments fell. Command buried the evidence to save face. They burned your team alive on paper. I know, Ava said. I watched the fire. He turned back, eyes searching hers for anger or grief or something human. But all he found was quiet. A quiet that came from someone who had already screamed and outlived the echo. He sat, the leather of his chair creaking. Why come back? Ava's gaze drifted to the files. You built this base to train soldiers for terrain they'll never understand. I came back to make sure they do. Heller stared at her for a long time, then closed the folder. The sound was soft but final, like the ceiling of a grave. Wolfpack Alpha, he murmured, almost to himself. Every file, every insignia, every trace gone. Except you. Ava stepped closer, her shadow cutting across the table. You can erase names, General. Not the lessons they bled for. The room held its breath. Finally, Heller nodded once, not as an officer, but as a man acknowledging something larger than command. He gathered the files, slid them back into the drawer, and turned the key. This conversation never happened. Ava gave a small nod. Most of mine don't. As she left the room, the lights dimmed to darkness, leaving only the faint outline of the photograph still on the table, the wolf's head watching, silent, eternal. Morning came to Camp Ravenfield with the weight of rumor pressing against every wall. The wind carried whispers sharper than gunfire, ghost, deserter, spy. Every corridor hummed with speculation. Recruits spoke in half-sentences, officers traded glances they didn't want to explain. The story of Lieutenant Ava Richter had outgrown fact overnight. Some said she'd walked out of a black site. Others claimed she'd been court-martialed and erased, her records rewritten by people who didn't officially exist. By sunrise, one truth had become clear. Whatever she wasn't just another soldier. The parade field filled before first light, boots aligned in neat formation, rifles glinting under a pale sky. At the far end, the shooting range stretched in silence, targets waiting like judgment. General Marcus Heller stood on the raised platform, the weight of old ghosts visible in the set of his shoulders. Beside him, Ava stood calm, her uniform stripped of insignia, sleeves rolled to the elbows, the faint edge of the wolf tattoo just visible beneath the fabric. The rifle slung across her chest gleamed in the morning haze, that same forbidden configuration that had started it all. When Heller spoke, his voice carried with the authority of a man who had spent a lifetime giving orders no one dared question. You've all heard the stories, he said. Most of you think you know what loyalty means, what survival looks like. But you've been trained in the safety of records and regulation. He turned slightly toward Ava, his tone deepening. Lieutenant Richter was part of a unit that never made the records, Wolfpack Alpha. Officially, they died on Tharsis Ridge. He paused, scanning the faces below. They didn't die. They adapted. A silence followed that seemed to swallow the air. The recruits shifted, uncertain whether to salute or step back. The name Wolfpack Alpha rolled through them like thunder through distant valleys, a name whispered in old stories, one that instructors denied and veterans avoided. Heller gestured toward the range. Show them, he said. Ava nodded once, no ceremony, no words. She moved down from the platform, her boots crunching over gravel, each step measured. The spectators parted instinctively, as though something primal in them recognized what their minds didn't yet understand. She stopped at the line, adjusted her rifle, and exhaled once. When the buzzer sounded, motion became art. The rifle swung fluidly from shoulder to hip, muzzle snapping from target to target with impossible rhythm. Every movement was an answer to a question no one had asked yet, the choreography of survival, brutal and elegant. The first shot cracked through the air, echoing across the valley. Then another. Then 8 more, each within a fraction of a heartbeat. Targets dropped clean, every impact center mass. At the 10th mark, she transitioned without pause, dropped to a knee, and fired a final round through the last silhouette's throat before the echo of the first had faded. 12 seconds. The range went silent. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. The recruits who had laughed at her days earlier stood frozen, faces drained, mouths half open. For the first time, they understood, not the technique, but the gravity behind it. She wasn't showing off. She was remembering. Heller descended from the platform, boots slow against the gravel. He stopped beside her, the old lines of command stripped away, leaving only recognition between equals. Then, with deliberate formality, he raised his hand and saluted. The sound of it, the sharp crack of his palm meeting the edge of his brow, broke the spell. One by one, the soldiers followed, until the entire field was a sea of raised hands and wide eyes. No one spoke. No one dared. Ava held his gaze for a heartbeat, then returned the salute with quiet precision. There was no pride in her expression, no satisfaction. Only peace, the kind that comes when the past finally stops chasing. When she turned away, the silence held, broken only by the soft rustle of flags in the morning wind. She walked toward the edge of the range, the sun burning through the low mist behind her. Her rifle hung diagonally across her shoulder, the cross-sling resting against her ribs, same as it had on Tharsis Ridge. As she disappeared into the light, Heller's voice carried over the field low, steady, meant only for those who would understand it. Some wolves don't need packs to remember who they are. The soldiers stood at attention long after she was gone, eyes fixed on the empty range. And though the day would resume, drills and orders and routine would reclaim the hours, every man and woman present knew something irreversible had shifted. The legend of Wolfpack Alpha wasn't dead. It had simply chosen to walk among them again, quiet, unseen, but awake.